She arrived with a rifle, a canvas sack, and eyes that saw things other people missed entirely. The year was 1887, and the Crow Ranch was dying. Everyone in 3 counties knew it. The cattle were gaunt, the fences were rotting, and the man who owned it had already started saying goodbye to it in his heart. What nobody knew was that a woman named Corinne Ashford was about to walk through that gate and see something no one else had been looking for. This is the story of how one woman read a broken land like a book and refused to let it end the way everyone expected. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The advertisement was only 11 words long, seeking capable woman, ranch work, Texas Panhandle. No questions asked. Corinne Ashford read it 3 times, folded the newspaper, and tucked it into her coat pocket. She was sitting in the back of a crowded rail depot in Amarillo, her boots still caked with mud from the last place she'd left, her canvas sack wedged between her feet like she didn't trust anyone else in the room, which she didn't. She was 31 years old, she had $4.60 to her name, and she had been 3 states in 2 years trying to find something that stuck. She wasn't a desperate woman. That was the thing people got wrong about her. Desperation has a smell to it, a kind of frantic quality that makes people sloppy. What Corinne had was more like calculation, a cold, patient willingness to look at a situation exactly as it was, without flinching, and then decide what to do next. It was a quality that had kept her alive in places where softer people had fallen apart. It was also a quality that made her hard to live with, and she knew that. She pulled the advertisement back out and read it a 4th time. No questions asked. That part was what got her. The stagecoach dropped her 8 miles short of where she needed to be because the driver said the road past the creek crossing was too rutted after the spring melt. She walked the rest of the way carrying her rifle on her shoulder and her sack in her left hand, and she used the time to look at the land. It was early April, and the Texas Panhandle was doing what it always did in April, trying to make up its mind. The grass was coming in patchy, yellow in some places, and a thin, struggling green in others. The sky was the kind of pale blue that looked pretty, but meant nothing. She passed 2 dry creek beds, 1 abandoned wagon, and a fence line that had been meant to mark a property boundary, but had 3 posts leaning at angles that suggested nobody had checked on it in at least a year. She stopped at the fence and examined the nearest post. The wood wasn't rotted. It was just loose, the ground around the base having heaved and softened over a wet winter. Somebody could fix this in an afternoon. Nobody had. She kept walking. The Crow Ranch announced itself with a hand-painted sign on a wooden crossbar over the gate. The letters had been done carefully at some point, but weather had faded them until Crow Ranch looked more like a suggestion than a statement. The gate itself was iron, which meant somebody had spent real money on it once. Past the gate, a dirt road ran about a 1/4 mile to a 2-story house with a porch that had a missing board on the left side. A barn stood to the east, large and reasonably solid-looking. Beyond the barn, she could see the beginning of pasture land, and she could see cattle, maybe 40 head from this distance, standing in a loose cluster near a water tank. She stood at the gate for a full 2 minutes, just looking. Then she opened it and walked through. Wesley Crow heard the dog bark and came out of the barn with a pitchfork in his hand, not because he was expecting trouble, but because he'd been mucking out a stall and hadn't set it down. He was 28, though he looked older. Not old man old, just worn, the way leather gets worn when it's been through too many seasons without being properly treated. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that needed shaving, and eyes that were a particular shade of brown that could look either warm or flat depending on the light. Right now, they looked flat. He saw the woman coming up his road, and he felt a complicated thing happen in his chest. The advertisement had been his foreman's idea. Hector had placed it before quitting 3 weeks ago, convinced that what the ranch needed was a manager of some kind, someone who could see the operation fresh. Wesley had told Hector he was out of his mind. He hadn't pulled the advertisement because he'd forgotten about it, or maybe because some part of him that he didn't want to examine too closely had left it there on purpose. She stopped about 10 feet from him. "You're the one who placed the ad," she said. It wasn't a question. "My foreman placed it," Wesley said. "He's gone now." "So the position is still open or it isn't?" He looked at her. She was carrying a rifle, a Winchester by the look of it, and well-maintained. Her coat was good quality but worn. Her boots were practical. Her eyes were doing something he noticed right away, which was moving. Not nervously, but deliberately, taking in the barn, the yard, the cattle visible in the distance, the house. She was reading things. He could tell. "I don't know what I'm looking for," he said. "My foreman thought I needed a manager. I'm not sure I need a manager. I'm not sure what I need." "Well," she said, "that's honest. Are you a ranch manager?" "I've managed parts of ranches. I've done bookkeeping, breeding records, pasture rotation, livestock assessment. I grew up on a ranch in Kansas before it was sold. I've worked 4 operations since then." She paused. "I'm good at seeing what's wrong. That's not a comfort when the thing you're seeing is my ranch." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but close. "It's not meant to be a comfort. It's meant to be useful." He was quiet for a moment. Behind him, one of the cattle made a sound, that low, particular moan that meant hunger rather than distress. He knew the sound. He'd been hearing it too much lately. "Where are your references?" he asked. "I have letters from 2 ranches in Colorado and 1 in New Mexico." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded envelope. "The New Mexico letter is short because the man I worked for couldn't write well. But he signed it." Wesley took the envelope but didn't open it yet. "What do you want in exchange?" "Room and board, $20 a month, and I want to be able to look at your records, all of them, going back as far as you have them." "Why the records?" "Because ranches don't fail from bad luck alone. They fail for reasons that usually show up in the records before they show up in the land. I want to know what your reasons are." He looked at her for a long moment. The dog, a gray cattle dog named Lupe, had come to sit beside Corinne's left boot and was looking up at her with an expression of cautious interest. Lupe didn't do that with strangers. "The house has a room off the kitchen," he said. "It's small. I've slept in worse. I can't promise $20 a month, not right now. I can promise 15 and a share of any improvement in sales if things turn around." She considered this. 15, and I want access to everything. Records, accounts, stock logs, correspondence, everything. That's a lot to show a stranger. "You put an ad in a newspaper," she said. "You already decided to show a stranger something." He looked at the cattle in the distance. He looked at the barn, which needed new planking on the north wall. He looked at the porch with its missing board, which he'd been meaning to fix for 4 months. "You can start tomorrow," he said. "Tonight I'll find you something to eat and show you the room." "I'll start this afternoon," Corinne said. "Show me the cattle first." "Boss." The cattle were bad. Not dying. She'd seen dying cattle, and there was a specific quality to them, a sunken hollowness around the eyes, and a particular way they held their weight back on their haunches. These weren't there yet, but they were thin in a way that suggested they'd been thin for more than 1 season, and the coat quality on 3 of them that she examined up close was rough in a way that pointed to mineral deficiency rather than just poor feed. She walked the fence line of the main pasture without speaking, and Wesley walked beside her with his hands in his pockets, watching her instead of the cattle. "How many head?" she asked. 46, down from 83 2 years ago. "What happened to the others?" "Some sold. Some didn't make the last 2 winters." He paused. "One winter was bad. The winter before wasn't, and they still struggled." She crouched beside the water tank and looked at the ground around it, the way the cattle had worn the soil, the direction of the wear patterns, what it said about their habits. "Are they moving enough, ranging the full pasture?" "They tend to cluster. They always have." "That's a problem." She stood. Cattle that cluster around a water source overgraze the immediate area and underuse the rest. They're working harder to find food than they should be, which means they're burning energy they should be putting into weight and coat. She looked across the pasture. "How many acres in this section?" 320. For 46 head. That's not the problem then. The problem is management. She looked at him. "Who was managing grazing rotation before?" "Hector had a system." "Can I see it?" "There's probably something written down in the office." They walked to the house. The office was a room off the main hall, barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs, with a window that looked out toward the barn. The desk had a surface covered in papers, some organized, most not. There were ledgers stacked on a shelf that went from floor to ceiling on the east wall. She stopped in front of the shelf and stood looking at the dates on the ledger spines. Your father's? She asked. Wesley was quiet for a second. He ran the ranch before me. He died 6 years ago. Can I look at his records? They go back 15 years. Good. She pulled the oldest ledger off the shelf without waiting for permission. She set it on the desk and opened it. Wesley watched her read. She didn't skim. She read properly, her finger moving along lines, her expression changing in small ways that he couldn't quite interpret. After 10 minutes, she pulled another ledger. After 20, she had 3 of them open on the desk simultaneously and was comparing entries across years. Your father was tracking breeding outcomes, she said. He kept records of everything. No, I mean, specifically, look at this. She turned one of the ledgers toward him and pointed. He's flagging certain calves separately from the main herd records. See this mark? The double line? He did it consistently, every year. She pulled the second ledger. Same mark here, 3 years later. And again here. She pointed at the third. He was tracking a specific line. Wesley frowned and leaned over to look. He'd gone through his father's records after the funeral, trying to understand the operation, but the ledgers had always seemed like a mass of detail that would take months to untangle. He'd given up after a few weeks. He never said anything about a specific breeding line, Wesley said. Did he talk to you about the ranch much? A pause. We didn't talk much about anything. She looked at him briefly, then back at the ledgers. These marks correspond to animals he kept back from sales. He wasn't selling the ones with the double mark. He was keeping them, year after year, building something. I'd need to cross-reference against the pasture records to be sure, but this looks deliberate. I don't know what he was building. Neither do I yet. She closed the top ledger carefully. But I'm going to find out. Dinner that night was a quiet affair. Wesley made a simple meal, beans and salt pork and cornbread from a batch he'd baked 2 days ago. And they ate at a kitchen table that was too large for 2 people, with a lamp between them and the darkness pressing in at the windows. How long has the ranch been struggling? Corinne asked. Define struggling. Losing money. He thought about it. 4 years of losses. Year before that, we broke even. Year before that was the last time we showed a profit. 5 years, she said. About that. What changed 5 years ago? He looked at his plate. My wife left. I lost a man to injury. Beef prices dropped that year and didn't come back up the way everyone said they would. Hector was good, but he wasn't my father, and He stopped. I wasn't paying attention the way I should have been. She didn't respond to the personal part, which he appreciated. Beef prices are still low, she said. That's not going away. Whatever solution exists here can't depend on prices improving. I know that. Do you know how much debt you're carrying? He was quiet for a moment. There was a quality to the silence that told her the number was bad. $1,800, he said. Due by the end of summer. She set down her fork. That's significant. Yes. And your current projection for sales this season? If prices hold and I sell everything ready for market, maybe 900. She was doing the math in her head. He could see it in her eyes. You're going to come up short. I know. He said it flatly, without drama. That was the worst thing about it. He'd already moved past the stage of being upset about it. He was in the stage of simply knowing. I've been trying to figure out what to sell to cover the gap. The horses, maybe. Some equipment. Selling equipment will hurt you long-term. Long-term and short-term are starting to feel like the same thing. She picked her fork back up and ate for a minute, thinking. I want 2 weeks, she said. To do what? To understand what's actually on this ranch. The cattle, the land, the records, all of it. She looked at him directly. Don't sell anything yet. Give me 2 weeks, and then we'll talk about what to do. Wesley looked at her. A woman he'd known for 4 hours was asking him to hold off on the decisions he'd been building toward for months. The reasonable thing was to say no. The reasonable thing was to remind her that she was new here, and he was the one who understood his situation. But Lupe was asleep on the floor beside her chair, and the dog did not do that. 2 weeks, he said. Then we talk. She was up before dawn the next morning. Wesley came down at 5:30 to find the kitchen cold. She hadn't bothered with the stove. And Corinne already gone. He found her in the north pasture at first light, walking the fence line with a notebook in her hand, writing things down in a handwriting so small he'd have needed a magnifying glass to read it. She spent that first week doing nothing but looking. She walked every acre of pasture he had. She examined the creek that ran along the eastern boundary and noted where the banks were eroding. She looked at the soil in the south section and did something he'd never seen anyone do. She dug up small samples and examined them, rubbing the dirt between her fingers, smelling it, once actually tasting a pinch of it, and spitting it back out immediately with an expression of distaste. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Checking the clay content. The south section drains badly. I can see it in the grass pattern. If it's high clay, we can't do much. If it's the topsoil layer, we can fix it." "Fix it how?" "Deep dissing in the fall, then overseed with a grass variety that handles the wet. It'll take 2 seasons to show results." "I might not have 2 seasons." She looked at him. "I know. I'm still thinking about next spring." He found that either maddening or reassuring, depending on the day. She went through his father's ledgers every evening after supper, cross-referencing them against the current stock records, building something on paper that he couldn't quite follow. She put charts on the wall of the office, hand-drawn, dense with information, that she'd explain when he asked, but that never quite made full sense to him in real time. On the 8th day, she called him into the office. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She had 4 charts pinned to the wall and a ledger open on the desk. She stood in front of the charts the way a schoolteacher might stand in front of a blackboard, and she walked him through what she'd found. "Your father spent 12 years selectively breeding for cold tolerance," she said. "He started with a line of mixed cattle, Texas Longhorn crossed with something shorter-legged and more compact, probably brought down from the northern ranges. He kept back the calves that showed specific traits: dense winter coat, compact body, wide hooves, strong foraging instinct. Every year he pulled the best of them and kept them. Every year he sold the rest." Wesley stared at the chart. "I knew he kept certain cattle back. I thought he just liked them." "He wasn't keeping them because he liked them. He was building a herd that could survive conditions that killed ordinary cattle. Look at these survival rates." She pointed to a column of numbers. The animals with the double mark in his records had a winter survival rate of 91% in the bad winter of 1880. The rest of the herd lost 37%. "I didn't know those numbers." "They're in the records. He just didn't explain what they meant." She pointed to the current stock list. "You still have 11 animals that carry that bloodline directly. You sold or lost the others without knowing what you were selling." Wesley felt something uncomfortable happen in his chest. "How do you know which ones?" "Because he ear-tagged them. Small notch, upper right ear, consistent. I checked every animal on the property." She looked at him steadily. 11 animals, Wesley. That's what's left of 12 years of work." He sat back in the chair. The lamp between them made shadows on the wall charts. "So what does that mean?" he asked. "For the debt, for this season, what does it actually mean?" She sat down across from him. "It means you have an asset that nobody knows you have, including you, but it doesn't solve your problem by itself. 11 animals aren't enough to build a strategy around this season." "Then what are we doing?" "We're figuring out what we have. That's what I said 2 weeks would do." She paused. "I have an idea. I want more time to think through it before I tell you, because I want to be sure it makes sense before I say it out loud." "How much more time?" "A week. Maybe less." He looked at the charts on the wall. All that careful work, all that information assembled and organized in 8 days by a woman he'd known for 8 days. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone more—" He stopped. "Someone who would tell me everything was going to be fine." "Everything might not be fine," she said, "but it might not be as bad as you think. Those are different things." She closed the ledger and stood up, and Wesley sat for a while longer in the office after she'd gone, looking at the charts on his wall and thinking about his father, who had spent 12 years building something without ever finding the words to explain what it was. There was a neighbor named Clifford Bent who came by on the 10th day of Corinne's time at the ranch. Bent ran the operation 2 miles north and had always had a particular quality that Wesley couldn't pin down but didn't like, a kind of surface friendliness that felt like it had something underneath it. He was 60 years old, heavy through the shoulders, with the easy manner of a man who had been successful long enough that he'd stopped worrying about being liked. He came in a good wagon with a team of matched horses, which was the kind of thing he did. Wesley was in the yard when Bent arrived, and Corinne came out of the barn at the sound of the wagon, wiping her hands on a cloth. Bent's eyes found her immediately. "Didn't know you had hired help," Bent said. "Recent addition," Wesley said. Bent climbed down from the wagon and removed his hat in a gesture that managed to be both polite and condescending. "Clifford Bent," he said to Corinne. "Corinne Ashford." She didn't offer her hand. She just looked at him with the same evaluating quality she applied to fence posts and soil samples. Bent turned back to Wesley. "I heard you've been having some trouble with the spring calving." "It's early yet," Wesley said. Sure. Bent glanced around the yard in a way that took in the missing porch board, the barn's north wall, the general condition of things. He had the eyes of a man who priced things automatically. "I wanted to let you know, if you find yourself needing to consolidate, I'm in a position to make a fair offer. For the land, the improvements, the remaining stock, all of it." Wesley felt his jaw tighten. "I'm not looking to sell. Nobody ever is, until they are." Bent said it pleasantly. "I'm just saying the offer stands. You know where I am." Corinne spoke, and her voice was light and conversational. "What would you do with the cattle, Mr. Bent, if you bought the operation?" Bent looked at her with the expression of a man who hadn't expected the question. "Absorb them into my own herd, I expect. Replace the stock with better quality animals over time." "Better quality how?" "Larger frame, more beef per animal. The future is in size, not—" He gestured vaguely at the pasture. "Whatever's been happening here." She said it neutrally, without inflection, and looked out at the pasture. Bent shifted his weight. "I don't mean any offense, it's just business thinking." "Of course," she said. After he left, Wesley found her standing at the fence looking at the cattle with an expression he was starting to recognize. The look that meant she was running calculations. "He's been watching this place," she said. "He's always watched this place. He watched my father's place, too. He wants the land. He's always wanted the land. Our eastern creek feeds into his main pasture. He's wanted that water access for years." She was quiet for a moment. "He thinks the cattle are worthless." "Most people think the cattle are worthless. That might be the most useful thing about them," she said. Wesley looked at her sideways. "What does that mean?" "It means if your cattle were obviously valuable, Bent would already be trying harder to get them." She turned away from the fence. "I'm going back to the records." On the 14th day, she came to find him in the barn. He was patching the north wall. He'd finally gotten to it, buying lumber with the last of a small account he'd been holding back. And she stood in the barn doorway with her notebook and waited until he finished driving a nail before she spoke. "I'm ready to tell you the idea," she said. He set the hammer down and turned around. "All right," he said. She came into the barn and sat on a bale of hay and opened the notebook. He pulled a stool from the corner and sat across from her. Outside, the April wind was doing its restless thing across the panhandle, and the cattle were moving in the north pasture. He could hear them. "You can't sell your way out of this debt," she said. "Not at current prices, not without destroying the operation to pay for the remnants of it. So selling is off the table." "I've been thinking the same thing. What you can do is build something that changes your position before the note comes due." She looked at him steadily. "Your father built 11 animals that are worth considerably more than anyone knows. I want to build a breeding program around them, expand the line, document it properly, and offer breeding access to other ranchers who've had the same winter losses you have." He was quiet, processing this. "Breeding fees. Not just fees. I want to approach 4 or 5 ranchers within 50 miles who lost significant stock in the last hard winter and offer them something specific. A breeding contract that guarantees the bloodline traits your father documented. Early calving strength, winter coat density, cold tolerance. We have the records to back it up. Nobody else does. I'd need to prove the claims. The records prove them, and I can compile them into a document that any rancher can read and understand." She paused. "But there's more. The breeding program alone doesn't fix your cash problem this season. We also need to restructure the grazing so the existing herd recovers. I can get these 46 animals into significantly better condition by fall if we change their patterns now. Better condition means better sale weight, which means more money from the same number of animals. That still doesn't close an $1,800 gap." "No," she said, "not alone, but combined. Better sale weight in fall, 3 or 4 breeding contracts at between $40 and $60 each, and one other thing. What other thing? There's a pasture on your south section that you're not using. The drainage issue makes it usable only in late spring and early summer. But late spring and early summer is exactly when your neighbor to the east. She checked her notebook. Harlan Price. I know Harlan. Harlan's summer pasture floods badly from the creek. He moves his cattle every June and has nowhere good to put them. I think he'd pay a grazing lease for your south section for those 3 months. Wesley stared at her. I've never thought of that. Harlan's cattle would also condition the soil there. They'd break up the compaction, deposit nutrients. It actually helps you. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Lupe barked once at something and went silent again. If any of this doesn't work, he said, we'll be further in debt. The breeding contracts require almost no capital outlay. The grazing lease is income with minimal risk. The herd conditioning costs time, not money. She looked at him with the directness he was getting used to. I said I was going to look at this ranch for 2 weeks and then tell you what I saw. This is what I see. He stood up and walked to the open barn door and looked out at the land his father had spent his life on. The land he'd spent 6 years losing his grip on. The sky was the flat pale blue of early spring, and the wind was moving the grass in patterns he'd watched all his life without ever quite reading them the way Corinne read them. You believe this works, he said. I believe it's the best path. I don't guarantee anything. He turned around. What do you need from me? I need you to trust the records. I need you to back me up when I talk to other ranchers because they're going to question a woman making these claims. And I need you standing behind the numbers. She paused. And I need you to not sell the 11 animals no matter what happens. Whatever else has to go, those stay. He looked at her for a long moment. Deal, he said. That night, she sat alone at the desk in the office long after Wesley had gone to sleep. The ledgers were arranged in front of her in the order his father had kept them. 15 years of careful record-keeping by a man who'd apparently known exactly what he was building, but never managed to explain it to the person who would inherit it. She thought about that, the gap between what a person knew and what they managed to pass on. She'd seen it in other ranches, other operations, the knowledge that lived inside one person's head and died there. She opened the oldest ledger to the first page. In her father's handwriting, in Wesley's father's handwriting, a careful slanted script, were the words that started the first entry. Spring. Kept back the 3 calves with dense coat and wide feet, the others sold. We'll see what comes of it next winter. Simple. Patient. A man starting something he knew wouldn't show results for years. She read for another hour, and the wind pressed against the windows of the small house on the panhandle. And somewhere in the north pasture, the cattle moved quietly in the dark, carrying in their blood the results of a project that had almost been forgotten. She was not going to let it be forgotten. She turned the page and kept reading. The first rancher she approached told her no before she'd finished her second sentence. His name was Dillard Foss, and he ran 600 head on a spread 20 miles southeast of the Crow Ranch, and he had the particular confidence of a man who'd been doing something a long time without anyone telling him he was doing it wrong. He was standing at his own fence when Corinne rode up on the roan mare Wesley had lent her, and he listened to the first part of what she had to say with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back, and then he shook his head. I appreciate the visit, ma'am, but I'm not in the habit of paying breeding fees to a ranch that's been losing stock for 4 years. The stock loss is what I'm trying to address, Corinne said. The bloodline I'm talking about. I know about Crow's cattle. I've seen them. They're small and they're thin, and they don't look like anything worth paying for. They're thin because of grazing management, not because of the bloodline. The bloodline is why any of them survived the winter of '84 at all. Foss looked at her flatly. The winter of '84 killed 20% of my herd. Are you telling me Crow's cattle came through better than that? I'm telling you his father's selectively bred animals came through at 91% survival. I have the records if you want to see them. He was quiet for a moment, not convinced. She could see that, but at least thinking instead of dismissing. Leave me the records, he said finally. I'll look at them. I'll leave you copies, she said. The originals stay at the ranch. She rode back to the Crow Ranch with her jaw set and her back straight, and she didn't let herself think about how that had gone until she was unsaddling the mare in the barn. Then she sat on the same hay bale where she'd laid out the plan for Wesley, and allowed herself about 3 minutes of honest discouragement. Boss hadn't said yes. She'd been braced for skepticism, but the particular quality of his dismissal, the way he'd looked past her twice to check if there was someone more authoritative behind her, had been wearing in a way she hadn't quite prepared for. Wesley came in while she was still sitting there. "How'd it go?" he asked. "He'll look at the copies." "That's not a yes." "No," she said. "It's not." She stood up. "Who's the most respected rancher within 40 miles? Not the biggest, the most respected. The one other people watch." Wesley thought about it. "Probably Ruth Hennessy. She runs a small operation north of Clarendon. She's been out here longer than anyone, and she's never taken a serious loss, which means people pay attention to what she does." "Is she the kind of person who listens?" "She's the kind of person who listens and then tells you exactly what she thinks, which is not always the same thing as being kind about it." "That's fine," Corinne said. "I don't need kind, I need honest." She went to see Ruth Hennessy 2 days later, and Wesley came with her this time, because Corinne had decided after the Foss visit that having him present mattered. Not because she needed him to speak for her, she'd been clear about that with him on the ride over, but because the numbers in the ledgers were his father's numbers. And when she referenced them, having the man whose father had written them standing beside her carried weight that she couldn't manufacture on her own. Ruth Hennessy was 63 years old, short and wide-shouldered, with gray hair pinned back practically and hands that showed 40 years of ranch work. She met them at her door and looked at them both with equal assessment and said, "Coffee's on. Come in." Her kitchen was clean and functional, nothing decorative except a single framed photograph on the wall that Corinne didn't look at closely enough to identify. Ruth poured 3 cups without asking if they wanted any, and sat across from them at a table that had clearly been used for serious conversations many times before. Corinne laid out the copies of the breeding records. Ruth put on a pair of spectacles from her shirt pocket and read without speaking for a solid 5 minutes. She turned pages. She went back to reread something. She set the papers down and took off her spectacles. "Howard Crow kept these?" she asked Wesley. "Yes, ma'am. Your father was a strange man," she said. Not unkindly, just as a fact. He never talked about what he was doing. I asked him once, years ago, why he kept those small-framed cattle when everyone was moving toward bigger animals. He said he was waiting to see. She looked at the papers again. "I thought he was just being stubborn." "He was," Wesley said. "He was also right." Ruth looked at Corinne. "And you figured this out from the records. It's in the records clearly, if you know what you're looking at." "What do you want from me?" Corinne was direct. "I want you to consider a breeding contract. 2 of your cows to the bull we have carrying the strongest expression of the bloodline, fee of $50, with a written guarantee of the documented traits. You can't guarantee traits. I can guarantee the documented lineage and the historical outcomes, the same thing a horse breeder guarantees when they sell you a bloodline. You're paying for the history of what this line has produced, not a promise about one individual animal." Ruth was quiet. She looked at Wesley. "You believe in this?" Wesley hesitated for a moment, the honest kind of hesitation, not the evasive kind. 3 weeks ago, I didn't know what was in my father's records. Corinne found it. I've looked at the same numbers she has, and yes, I believe in it." "You didn't know your father kept those records?" "He wasn't a man who explained things." Something softened slightly in Ruth's expression. "No, he wasn't." She looked down at her coffee cup. "My neighbor lost 31 head last winter. My winter loss was 4. People always assumed I was lucky. I'm not lucky. I've been managing for cold tolerance for years without tracking it the way Howard did." She looked back at Corinne. "If what you're showing me is accurate, Howard was doing the same thing, just more carefully." "More carefully and longer," Corinne said. Ruth was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I'll do 1 cow. $35, not 50, because you're new to this and 1 season of breeding outcomes isn't proof of anything. If the calf shows what you're claiming, we talk about more next year." Corinne kept her expression neutral. 35 and a written agreement that you'll tell 2 other ranchers about the program if the outcome matches the records. Ruth looked at her for a moment. "You're not just selling breeding rights, you're building a reputation." "I'm trying to." Ruth picked up her coffee. "All right, 1 cow, $35. And if you're wrong, I'll tell people that too." "Fair enough," Corinne said. On the ride back, Wesley was quiet for the first 10 minutes. The panhandle stretched around them in the pale afternoon light, flat and wide and indifferent, and the horses moved at a steady walk on the rutted road. "She said yes," he said finally. "She said yes to one cow at $35. That's still a yes." Corinne looked at the road ahead. "It's a start. We need 3 more like it before I feel like this is actually working." "You're hard to satisfy." "I'm practical," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet again. Then, without looking at her, "I didn't know my father had spectacles." She looked at him. He was watching the road. "Ruth wore spectacles when she read the records," he said, "and I suddenly thought, I don't know if my father wore them. I don't know if he needed them to read his own ledgers at the end, or if his eyes were still good. I realized I don't know things like that about him." Corinne didn't say anything immediately. The wind moved through the grass on both sides of the road. "The ledgers are careful all the way through," she said, "to the last entries. His handwriting doesn't change. If his eyes were going, it doesn't show." Wesley nodded slowly. It wasn't what he'd really been asking, and they both knew it, but it was something concrete to hold on to. "He built something real," Corinne said, "even if he couldn't find a way to explain it to you." "That's a generous reading of it." "Maybe, but the records are generous. He cared about what he was leaving behind. He just couldn't say it out loud." Wesley didn't respond to that. He clicked his tongue at the horse, and they moved a little faster, and the subject passed the way difficult subjects do on long rides. Not resolved, just absorbed into the distance. The second rancher, a man named Pete Calder, who ran a small operation west of them, agreed to 2 cows at $40 each after an hour of back and forth that Corinne found exhausting but productive. Calder was the kind of man who needed to feel like he'd negotiated something in order to feel good about an agreement, so she'd gone in asking 60 and let him work her down to 40, which was what she'd wanted in the first place. Wesley had caught on to what she was doing halfway through and had the good sense to keep his face neutral. Afterward, walking to the horses, he said quietly, "You were never going to take 60. 60 would have been fine if he'd taken it. 40 is what I needed." "That's a little dishonest." "That's negotiating," she said. "There's a difference." He made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been disagreement. She couldn't tell. The grazing work was happening at the same time, and it was in some ways harder than the business conversations because it required daily physical effort that showed results slowly and frustratingly. Corinne had mapped out a rotation system using the pasture acreage they had, dividing the main pasture into 3 sections and moving the herd between them on a 3-week cycle, keeping the cattle off each section long enough for the grass to recover before they returned. The cattle did not cooperate gracefully with this plan. Moving 46 head of animals that had clustered in the same area for years required patience that Corinne did not always have in generous supply. The first rotation took the better part of a full day, with Wesley on horseback on one side and Corinne on the other, and Lupe running herself ragged in between, and by the end of it, 3 animals had broken through a weak section of fence and had to be retrieved from the neighboring field. "I thought you said this would take a morning," Wesley said, covered in dust, as they rode back with the 3 strays. "I thought it would," Corinne said. "So you were wrong." "I was wrong about the timeline. I'm not wrong about the rotation. They'll settle into it." He looked sideways at her. "You're not good at being wrong." "Nobody is." "You're especially not good at it." She looked at him. "I fixed the fence on the south section this morning, and I rode to Calder's and back, and I helped you chase 3 cows across 2 fields. I'm allowed to underestimate how long one thing would take." He held up a hand. "I'm not attacking you, I'm just noticing." "Notice it quietly," she said. He did laugh then, and it surprised both of them, and neither of them commented on it. The Harlan Price conversation happened on a Wednesday, at the fence line between their properties, where Corinne had arranged to meet him by sending a note through a boy from the nearest town. Price was a round-faced, slow-speaking man in his late 40s, who gave the impression of being unconcerned about most things, which she'd learned from Wesley was actually accurate rather than a performance. She explained the grazing lease proposal in plain terms, and Price listened with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the south section she was describing. 3 months, he said. June, July, August. And the price? $15 for the season. Price was quiet for a moment. He picked up a handful of soil from the ground at his feet and looked at it, which Corinne found interesting. 20, he said. 18, she said. Done. He dropped the soil and brushed his hands off. You know this section floods in June. First 2 weeks, sometimes 3. I know. Your cattle would come in when the water clears. And if my cattle tear up your fence, then your cattle tore up my fence and you'll need to fix it. He looked at her with an expression of mild amusement. You're direct. Is that a problem? No. I find it restful, actually. He looked at the section again. I'll have my man bring the terms in writing next week. That's fine. She told Wesley about the agreement at supper that evening, and he did the arithmetic out loud. 18 from Price, 35 from Ruth Hennessy, 80 from Calder's 2 cows, and the 4th breeding contract she was still pursuing with a rancher named Oaks, who'd lost 40 head the previous winter and was reportedly open to alternatives. If Oaks agrees, we're looking at somewhere between $170 and $200 from these agreements, Wesley said. Which isn't $1,800, Corinne said. No, but it's $200 we didn't have, and the herd condition is already improving. I noticed 2 of the cows in the north section yesterday. They're filling out. Their coats are looking better. She nodded. The rotation is working. It'll take until August to see the full effect, but by fall sale time, the average animal should be carrying significantly more weight. How much more? If the pasture responds the way I think it will, 40, maybe 50 pounds per animal on average. At current prices, that's meaningful. Wesley set down his fork and looked at the table. It still might not be enough. For the debt. I know. I'm not saying your plan is wrong. I'm saying the numbers are still tight. The numbers are very tight, she agreed. I haven't solved the problem. I've changed the shape of it. He looked up at her. What's the difference? The difference is that a problem shaped like a slow collapse is different from a problem shaped like a very hard season. One of them has an end you can work toward. The other one doesn't. She picked up her fork again. We have a hard season. That's what we're dealing with. He looked at her for a moment, a longer moment than was comfortable, and she met it without looking away, which she wasn't sure was the right instinct, but it was the one she had. You believe that, he said. I believe it's accurate. That's not the same as believing it. She thought about that. I believe the 11 animals are worth protecting. I believe your father was right. I believe the land in the south section can be recovered. I believe the rotation will work. She paused. I believe there's a path here. Whether we get to the end of it, that depends on a lot of things neither of us can control. He was quiet. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me about this ranch in 4 years, he said. What did people say before? Either that it was hopeless or that it would be fine. Nobody said it was hard and real and uncertain. He pushed his plate back slightly. My father never said those things either. He just worked. Working is a way of saying it. Is it? It's what you've been doing. You haven't quit. He looked like he wanted to argue with that, or maybe he just wasn't used to someone pointing it out. Either way, he didn't respond, and Corinne didn't push. She'd learned that Wesley processed things in silence the way other people process them out loud, and trying to accelerate it didn't work. She cleared the plates and went back to the office, and she sat with the 4th set of records she was compiling for Oaks, and worked until the lamp needed trimming. What she didn't say at the table, what she kept to herself because she was still working through it, was the thing that was actually worrying her. Not the debt, not the breeding contracts, not the grazing rotation. Those were all manageable problems with visible solutions. What was worrying her was Clifford Bent. He'd come by twice more since that first visit, once with what he called a social call that lasted 20 minutes, and involved him walking slowly around the yard in a way that covered considerable ground, and once with an actual offer. Not the vague standing offer he'd made the first time, but a written document brought by his hired man laying out terms for the purchase of the ranch. The terms were low, significantly below what the land and water rights were worth, but they were clear and they were documented, which meant Bent had lawyers involved, which meant he was serious. She hadn't told Wesley about the second offer yet. She'd intercepted the letter from the hired man when Wesley was in the south field, and she'd read it, and she'd put it in the desk drawer under the ledgers. She knew she needed to tell him. She was going to tell him. She just needed to understand first what Bent was actually after. Because the offer as written didn't make economic sense. He was offering too little for the land to make a profit on resale, which meant he wanted something specific about the property, not just the acreage. She pulled out the county land map she'd borrowed from the courthouse in town and spread it on the desk. She traced the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of the Crow Ranch with her finger, followed it north to where it joined a larger tributary, followed that tributary east to where it crossed Bent's land. Then she traced it further to where the land record showed a proposed rail spur, surveyed 3 years ago, never built, but surveyed. That would need water access for a staging yard. She sat back. If the rail spur got built, and there were always rumors about rail expansion in this part of Texas, the water rights on the Crow Ranch's eastern creek became considerably more valuable, not ranch cattle valuable, infrastructure valuable, a different order of magnitude. Bent knew something, or he suspected something, and he was moving quietly and early before prices reflected what he knew. She sat with that for a long time in the quiet office, with the wind outside and the lamp burning low and the county map spread before her, and she thought about how much of the problem she was dealing with she actually understood, and how much was still below the surface. Then she put the map away, took the letter out of the desk drawer, and set it on top of the ledgers where Wesley would find it in the morning. She was done keeping things from him. Whatever was coming, it was his ranch, and he needed to know. Wesley found the letter at 6 in the morning. Corinne heard him come down the stairs, heard the particular sound of the office chair scraping back, and then heard nothing for a long time. She was already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, waiting. She'd been awake since 4:30, which was becoming a habit she didn't love. He came into the kitchen holding the letter and the county map both, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her with an expression that was working through several things at once. "How long have you had this?" he asked. 3 days. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. He put the letter and the map on the table between them. "You should have told me right away." "I know. I wanted to understand what I was looking at before I brought it to you. It's my ranch, Corinne." "I know it is." She didn't argue the point further because he was right. "I'm telling you now." He looked at the letter again. The offer was written in the careful, neutral language of a man who had paid a lawyer to make it sound reasonable. $2,400 for the land, improvements, water rights, and remaining livestock. At first glance, it looked generous. It would cover his debt with room to spare. At second glance, which Corinne had now taken many times, it looked like a number calculated to be just attractive enough to accept in a moment of desperation. "The water rights," Wesley said. He'd seen it too. He's specifically itemizing the water rights separately. "Yes." "Why does he want the water rights itemized?" She slid the county map across the table and pointed to the rail spur survey line. "Because if that spur gets built, and I went to the courthouse records and it's still an active survey, they haven't abandoned it, the water access on your eastern creek becomes worth considerably more than what he's offering for the whole property." Wesley stared at the map. She watched him trace the same line she'd traced, follow it to the same conclusions. "How much more?" he asked quietly. "Water rights for a rail staging yard? I don't know exactly, but I've heard of similar arrangements in other parts of Texas going for $8,000–10,000. He looked up from the map. His face was doing something controlled and deliberate, the way faces do when the thing underneath would be too much to let out directly. "He knows about the survey," Wesley said. "He almost certainly does. He has money and connections in this county. That kind of information moves through certain circles. And my father never knew. The survey was 3 years ago. Your father had been gone 3 years by then." Wesley pushed back from the table and stood up. He went to the window that looked out at the yard, at the barn, at the line of fence that ran east toward the creek he'd played beside as a boy. The creek his father had considered unremarkable, the creek that might be the most valuable thing on the property. "If I'd taken his first offer," Wesley said, "his standing offer, if I'd agreed when he came by the first time." "You didn't." "I almost did. Last year, before Hector left, I almost called on Bent and asked if the offer was still there." He kept his back to her. "I was that close to it." Corinne let that sit for a moment. "But you didn't." "Not because I was smart. Because I was too tired to make the trip." She looked at the back of his head, the dark hair that still needed cutting, the set of his shoulders that was carrying more than it showed. She'd been working beside this man for 6 weeks, and she knew his silences now. This one was the kind that meant he was deciding whether to be angry or whether to be scared, and he hadn't landed yet. "What do we do?" he asked. "We don't respond to the offer," she said. "Not yet, and maybe not at all. But we need to understand what our options are if the rail spur becomes real." She paused. "And we need to make sure Bent can't find another way to pressure you towards selling." He turned around. "What other way?" "Your debt note. Who holds it?" "Merchants Bank in Clarendon. Man named Aldrich." "Does Bent have any relationship with Aldrich?" Wesley's expression shifted. I don't know." "Why?" "Because if Bent knows about the survey and he wants your water rights, the simplest way to force a sale is to put pressure on your debt. If your note gets called early, or if Aldrich refuses to extend—" She stopped. "You think Bent would do that?" "I think Bent is a man who has been quietly waiting for this property for years and has now written a formal purchase offer, which means he's moved from patient to active. I don't know what he'd do, but I know what I'd do in his position, and what I'd do is find the point of maximum pressure." Wesley sat back down. He folded the letter along its original creases. He folded it again until it was small, and then he set it on the table. "I need to go see Aldrich," he said. "Yes. Find out where we stand with the note, whether there's been any unusual contact from Bent's direction." "Yes." "And if there has been?" Corinne thought about it. "Then we know what we're dealing with, and we figure out the next step from there." He looked at the folded letter. "My father used to say that land trouble in Texas is never just about land." He was right about that. He was right about a lot of things I didn't appreciate at the time. He stood again, picking up his hat from where it hung by the door. "I'll ride to Clarendon tomorrow morning. I'll come with you." He looked at her. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I want to understand your arrangement with the bank directly. If this situation gets complicated, I need to know the details." He considered this for a moment. "All right." The ride to Clarendon took 2 hours, and they did most of it in a silence that was not unfriendly, just occupied. Corinne had been on enough of these rides with him now that she'd stopped feeling the need to fill the quiet. The Panhandle was doing something beautiful that morning in the way it occasionally did when you weren't expecting it. The light at that angle made the grass look almost silver, and a line of clouds on the northern horizon had gone pink and orange in a way that was genuinely pretty without requiring comment. She was thinking about the breeding program. Oaks had finally agreed. $45, 3 cows, a written contract, and that had brought their total from agreements to $215, which felt like proof of something and also like not nearly enough. The herd rotation was working. She was increasingly confident of that, but the grazing results wouldn't translate into sale weight until fall, and fall was still 4 months away, and the debt was due at the end of summer. The gap between what they had coming in and what they owed was still real. She'd been running numbers in her head every morning, and she kept arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. The plan was right, and it might still not be enough. The bank was a single-story brick building on Clarendon's main street, and the man who ran it, Aldrich, was the kind of bank manager who decorated his office with things meant to communicate stability. Heavy furniture, framed documents on the wall, a large desk that was slightly too large for the room. He stood when they came in and shook Wesley's hand and nodded at Corinne with professional neutrality. "Mr. Crow? It's been a while." "It has," Wesley said. "This is Corinne Ashford. She manages operations at the ranch." Aldrich looked at her with slightly more interest than the neutral nod had suggested. "Ms. Ashford." "Mr. Aldrich." She sat when Wesley sat and put her hands in her lap and let Wesley do the talking, because this was his relationship and his money, and she was here to listen. Wesley asked about the note. Aldrich reviewed it in a way that managed to convey both familiarity and slight distance. Yes, the note was due end of summer. Yes, the terms were as originally stated. No, there had been no changes to the arrangement. He said all of this smoothly, and Corinne watched his hands while he said it, which was a habit she had. His hands were still. Too still. People who were telling a completely uncomplicated truth didn't work to keep their hands still. "Has anyone else inquired about the note?" she asked. Aldrich looked at her. "I beg your pardon?" "The note on the Crow Ranch. Has anyone else made inquiries about it? About the terms, the due date, the outstanding amount?" "That would be confidential information, Ms. Ashford. Bank business." "I understand. I'm asking whether anyone has tried to access that information, not whether you shared it. Those are different questions. A pause. Aldrich looked at Wesley. Your manager is quite direct. Yes, Wesley said. Answer the question, please. Another pause, shorter this time. There has been some general interest in the area's debt situation from a local investor. That's not unusual in times when properties may become available. Clifford Bent, Wesley said. Aldrich didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. Wesley's voice went flat in the way it did when he was working hard to keep it level. And have you had any conversations about the terms of my note specifically? Mr. Crow, I have an obligation to my depositors and investors. Have you had any conversations about calling my note early? Silence. Corinne felt something cold move through her chest. Calling the note early, demanding full repayment before the agreed due date, which was possible under certain conditions written into most bank loans, would be catastrophic. It would give Wesley weeks instead of months, and weeks was not enough time for anything they were building to produce results. On what grounds? She asked, keeping her voice level. What grounds would the bank use to call the note early? Aldrich shifted in his chair. Certain conditions in the loan agreement allow for early collection in cases of material deterioration of the collateral, meaning the ranch's condition, meaning the assessed value of the property and livestock. When was the property last assessed? Our records reflect the assessment from the original loan issuance. So a current assessment would show what? What would a current assessment show, Mr. Aldrich? He looked uncomfortable. I'm not in a position to speculate. You are in a position to tell us if an assessment has been ordered, Wesley said. The silence that followed was its own answer. Wesley stood up. He did it slowly, which was more frightening somehow than if he'd done it quickly. If someone is pressuring this bank to call my note early in order to force a sale, that is a matter I will take to the county judge. I want you to understand that clearly. Mr. Crow, I want you to also understand that the value of my ranch is not what your records from 3 years ago say it is. The breeding program we're running and the grazing improvements we've made in the past 6 weeks have materially changed the asset picture. Before any assessment is conducted, I'd suggest your bank request a current inventory. He picked up his hat. Good day, Mr. Aldrich. They walked out. On the boardwalk outside, in the bright morning sun, Wesley stood for a moment with his hat in his hands, not putting it on. Corinne stood beside him. He's already been in contact with Bent, Wesley said. Yes. They're going to try to call the note. Maybe. Maybe not. You pushed back. That matters. Banks don't like complications, and threatening a legal challenge introduces complications. She paused. But we should assume they might try it. What do we do if they do? She thought about it. We need someone in our corner who understands land and water law. Is there a lawyer in this county who isn't already in Bent's pocket? Wesley thought for a moment. There's a man named Casper Doyle in Wheeler County. He handled a water dispute for my father years ago. He's not from here. He came out from Missouri and never quite fit in with the local business crowd. That might be exactly right. Can you get a message to him? I can ride there this week. Do it. She looked down the main street, at the ordinary activity of a small town, people going about their Thursday, nothing suggesting that in an office back there a banker was probably already composing a message to a wealthy rancher about a note on a struggling property. We also need to accelerate something. What? The pasture assessment. I can put together a written evaluation of the ranch's current condition, livestock health, pasture recovery, projected sale outcomes, breeding program documentation. If they order a formal assessment, I want our own documentation already prepared and in the hands of anyone who might need to see it. You can do that? I've been keeping records since I got there. It's mostly organization at this point. She put her hat back on. The numbers are good, Wesley. Not perfect, but genuinely good. If anyone looks at this ranch objectively right now, they see an operation that's improving, not declining. He looked at her. The morning light was stark and honest. Is that true, or are you saying it to keep me steady? Both, she said, but mostly true. That got something from him. Not a smile exactly, but close. They rode home and got to work. The document she produced over the next 4 days was 22 pages, written in her small, careful hand, covering every aspect of the ranch's current and projected state. She cross-referenced it against his father's records, against the breeding contracts, against the grazing rotation logs she'd been keeping since April. She included the survival rate data, the weight gain projections, the creek bank recovery she'd observed in the eastern section. She wrote a section specifically on the bloodline and its documented performance across 15 years. Wesley read it at the kitchen table over 2 evenings. "This is more thorough than anything in the bank's records," he said. "That's the point." "You wrote an argument," he said. "This isn't just data. You wrote a case." "Someone might need to make that case to a judge. I'd rather have it written now." He looked at a page and then up at her. "You've done this before. Not ranching. This specifically. Writing a case for something." She was quiet for a moment. "Before Kansas, I worked for 2 years helping a land attorney in Missouri document homestead claims. People would come in with their land, their records, their histories, and we'd build arguments for why their claim was valid." She paused. "A lot of them lost, anyway, because the other side had more money, but the ones who had good documentation had a fighting chance." "What happened to the ones who didn't have good documentation?" "They lost their land." He nodded slowly. He turned another page. "Is that why you left Missouri?" he asked. She considered how much to answer. "I left because the attorney I worked for decided that money was a better guide than right and wrong, and the two things stopped pointing in the same direction." He looked at her. "He started working for the people trying to take the land," she said, "instead of the people trying to keep it." Wesley was quiet for a moment. "And you couldn't do that." "I could not do that," she said simply. He looked back at the document. "My father would have liked you," he said. He said it without looking up, and there was something in the way he said it that made it more significant than a compliment. It was more like a revelation, something he'd figured out while sitting there reading. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which was usually the right answer. The message from Casper Doyle came back in 8 days. A note written in a terse, confident hand saying he'd reviewed the situation Wesley described, and he'd be willing to discuss representation and what were Wesley's records like. Wesley rode to Wheeler County on a Thursday and came back Friday afternoon with an agreement. "He's interested," Wesley said, pulling off his coat in the doorway. "He says the rail spur situation is more advanced than we knew. There was a county commissioners meeting last month. Apparently they discussed right-of-way options." "Which route?" "He doesn't know yet, but he's going to find out. And he said—" Wesley stopped and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. "He said if the spur route goes through or adjacent to the eastern section, the water rights on our creek could be worth $15,000. The number landed in the kitchen like something physical. "15,000, she said. "That's what he said. He's not certain, but he said it's not impossible." Corinne sat down. She'd been operating on the assumption that the water rights were valuable, but in an 8,000 to 10,000 range. Meaningful, significant, enough to change everything. 15,000 was a different scale. 15,000 was generational. 15,000 was the difference between saving a ranch and building a legacy. "Bent knows," she said. "He has to. Which means the pressure on the bank is going to increase. He wants this property before any of this becomes public knowledge." "Yes." She looked at the table. Outside, the evening wind was coming up, the way it did in late June, warm and persistent. She could hear the cattle moving in the north section, settling into their evening patterns. "We need to file something," she said, "with the county. Something that establishes our position on the water rights before any of this becomes a contested claim." Doyle mentioned that. "He's looking at options." "How long do we have?" "Before what?" "Before Bent moves. Before the bank does something." Wesley sat down across from her. He looked tired. The good kind of tired, the kind that comes from doing actual work rather than the heavy gray tired he'd had when she arrived. But underneath it, something was taut. "Doyle thinks 2 months," he said, "maybe less. If the commissioners vote on the right-of-way, then prices change overnight, and Bent has no reason to be subtle anymore." "Right." She looked at him. "So we have 2 months to either secure this position or lose it entirely." "That seems to be where we are." She thought about the breeding program, the rotation, the 22 pages sitting on his father's desk, all of it real, all of it working, all of it operating on a timeline that assumed they had until fall. "We need to move faster," she said. "On what specifically?" "Everything." She stood up. The sale weight documentation needs to be ready early. The breeding program results need to be in writing and witnessed. And we need Doyle to file whatever he can file to establish the water rights claim before anyone else does. She looked at him. And we need to do all of it without tipping Bent off that we know what he's after. Wesley looked at her steadily. If we pull this off, she said, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm just saying, if we do. He leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. You could have left, when you found the Bent letter. You could have taken your $15 and found another ranch to work on. Something less complicated. She looked at him. I could have. Why didn't you? She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. Because your father spent 12 years building something that nobody knew about, and I found it, and I don't walk away from things I've found. Wesley looked at her for a long moment. Outside, Lupe scratched at the door and then gave up and lay down against it. All right, he said finally. He stood and picked up his hat. Then let's not lose it. She nodded once, and they went back to work. Doyle filed the water rights claim on a Monday morning in early July, and by Wednesday afternoon, Clifford Bent knew about it. They knew he knew because his hired man showed up at the gate that same Wednesday with a note. Not a formal letter this time, no lawyer's language, just Bent's own handwriting on a folded piece of paper that said simply, "We should talk. My offer stands, and I am prepared to improve it." C.B. Wesley read it standing in the yard and handed it to Corinne without comment. She read it and handed it back. He's rattled. Bent doesn't rattle. He wrote this himself instead of having his lawyer write it. That's rattled. She looked at the hired man who was waiting with the patient expression of someone paid to wait. Tell Mr. Bent that Mr. Crow has received his note and will be in contact through his legal counsel. The hired man looked at Wesley as if checking whether the woman's answer was the actual answer. You heard her, Wesley said. The man left. Wesley folded the note and put it in his shirt pocket and stood looking at the gate for a moment. Doyle's filing was the right move. Yes, it establishes the claim before any right-of-way decision gets made. Bent can still fight it, but he can't quietly absorb it anymore. She looked toward the eastern section, toward the creek she could hear faintly on still mornings. How long before the commissioners vote? Doyle thinks 3 weeks, maybe 4. 3 or 4 weeks was both not long enough and exactly enough time, depending on what happened inside it. The calving season was already showing results. She'd been tracking it daily, making notes in a ledger she'd started herself, parallel to the old records, building the documentation they'd need. 11 of the target animals had produced calves in the spring cycle, and 9 of those calves were showing the coat density and frame characteristics that appeared in the father's breeding notes. 9 out of 11 was better than the historical average. She hadn't let herself say that out loud yet because she didn't want to tempt anything, but the number was sitting in her chest like something warm and fragile. The herd overall was different from what she'd found in April. The rotation had done what she'd said it would do. The cattle were carrying more condition, their coats were smoother, the clustering behavior around the water tank had broken up as they'd learned the pattern of moving between sections. 3 of the ranchers who'd seen the herd in April and dismissed it had ridden by in the past month and not said anything, which Corinne had learned to read as a specific kind of acknowledgement from men who didn't offer compliments easily. Ruth Hennessy had ridden by and had said something, which was different. She'd come on a Saturday morning, unannounced, and stood at the fence of the north section for a while looking at the cattle before she came to the house. Corinne had been in the office and heard the knock and answered it. Your breeding bull, Ruth said by way of greeting. Can I see him? Corinne walked her to the small, separate pen where they kept the primary breeding animal, one of the 11 original bloodline cattle, the one with the strongest expression of the traits his father had been selecting for. He was not a large animal. He was compact and deep-chested, and his winter coat, even in July, grew denser than it should have, and his hooves were wide and sure on the uneven ground. Ruth stood at the fence and looked at him for a long time without speaking. Howard used to bring me eggs sometimes, she said finally. In the early years. He knew I had trouble with my chickens. He'd just leave them on the porch without knocking. She kept looking at the bull. He never said why. He just did it until my flock sorted itself out. That took 3 years. Corinne waited. This animal is 12 years of him leaving eggs on a porch, Ruth said. Quietly, without explaining himself. That's one way to say it. Ruth turned to look at her. The calf I got from your breeding program. I want you to come look at him. He's 3 months old, and I'd like to hear what you think. I can come next week. Come Thursday, and bring your records. I want to show them to a man named Fowler. He's new to the area, he's got a good-sized operation, and he's already lost too many cattle to bad winters. He needs to see what Howard was doing. Corinne looked at her. You're helping us build the program. Ruth picked up her reins. I'm helping myself have better cattle in the future. The fact that it helps you is incidental. She mounted with the ease of a woman who'd been doing it for 4 decades. Thursday morning, she rode out, and Corinne stood in the yard and felt something that took her a moment to identify because it wasn't an emotion she had very often. It was something close to gratitude, which she generally found uncomfortable, so she went back inside and got to work. The problem that arrived that same week was the one she'd been bracing for. The letter from the bank came on a Tuesday. Not Aldrich's usual correspondence, a formal notice typed rather than handwritten, with the bank's full official heading at the top. It cited a clause in the loan agreement related to material change in collateral value and requested a formal property assessment to be conducted within 30 days, after which the bank reserved the right to adjust repayment terms. Wesley read it at the kitchen table and set it down very carefully. They're doing it, he said. Yes. 30 days. Yes. She sat across from him. She'd been expecting this since the Clarendon visit, had been half waiting for it every morning when she came downstairs, and now that it was here it felt less frightening than it had in anticipation. Actual problems were easier to deal with than imagined ones. Doyle needs to see this today. I'll ride this afternoon. Tell him we're requesting that the assessment be conducted by an independent evaluator, not someone from Clarendon, someone from outside the county. And tell him we want our documentation submitted as part of the official record before the assessment happens. Can we demand that? We can request it formally and make it very clear that if the bank ignores the request and proceeds with a favorable to Bent assessment, we'll raise that in any subsequent legal proceedings. She paused. Banks don't like legal proceedings. They're expensive and they're public, and they make depositors nervous. Wesley looked at the letter again. This is Bent pushing through Aldrich. Almost certainly. What if Doyle can't slow it down? Then we deal with the assessment as it comes, and we make sure our record is so complete and well documented that any honest assessor has to acknowledge what's here. She looked at him steadily. The ranch is better, Wesley. Genuinely better. That's not a story we're telling. It's what's actually happened in the last 3 months. The question is whether the person doing the assessing is honest. He was quiet for a moment. My father lost a land dispute once. I was maybe 10 years old. He lost it because the other man had more money and better connections, and it didn't matter what the truth was. He looked at the table. I used to think about that when I was old enough to understand it, how he never recovered something, not land, something else. He kept working, Corinne said. He kept working, but something went out of him. Wesley folded the bank letter along its crease. I'm not letting that happen. Then ride to Doyle this afternoon. He was up and reaching for his hat before she finished the sentence. Doyle's response was fast and pointed. He filed a formal objection to the assessment timeline, citing procedural grounds, and simultaneously submitted Corinne's 22-page documentation to the county records office, which made it part of the official property history regardless of what the bank did next. He also sent a letter to the bank's regional board, above Aldrich's head, noting that the timing of the assessment request coincided suspiciously with a pending water rights claim, and suggesting that the board might want to review the situation before allowing local management to proceed. He went over Aldrich, Wesley said when Doyle explained this. Aldrich is acting as an agent for someone else's interests, Doyle said. He was a compact man in his 50s with a dry, precise way of speaking that Corinne had come to appreciate. The board is a different matter. They care about the bank's reputation, not about Clifford Bent's land acquisitions. Will it work? Corinne asked. It'll slow things down. Whether it stops them depends on how much influence Bent has with the regional board. Doyle looked at her. How solid is your documentation? Very solid. Are there any numbers in it you can't defend? All of them are defensible. The projections are conservative. I deliberately kept them below what I actually expect, so we're not in the position of having overstated anything. Doyle looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating an assumption. You've done this kind of work before. Something like it. Good. He looked at Wesley. Your other immediate task is making sure Bent can't find another angle. He's going to keep looking for leverage. Are there any other debts? Any other outstanding obligations? The breeding contracts, Corinne said. We have income coming from those. When do the first payments clear? Ruth Hennessy paid at the time of signing, Wesley said. The others are structured as half now, half at breeding completion. When does breeding complete? End of July for most of them. So the second half payments come in August. She looked at Doyle, which is before the debt note's original due date. That's relevant. It demonstrates cash flow. Put it in writing, Doyle said. Every payment, every contract, every dollar. I want a complete accounting. They left his office in Wheeler County at 3 p.m. and rode home mostly in silence. The July heat was serious now, the kind that pressed down on the panhandle without apology, and the horses moved at a steady conservative pace. Corinne's hat was doing less than she wanted against the sun, and she could feel the back of her neck burning. About halfway home, Wesley said, I've been thinking about the water rights money. We don't have it yet. I know. I'm thinking about what we do if we get it. He rode for a moment. My first thought was to clear the debt and bank the rest. My second thought was that if the creek water rights are worth $15,000, what else on the property have I been undervaluing because I didn't know what I was looking at? She looked at him. It was the right question. The kind of question that meant he was thinking past the crisis to what came after it. The south section, she said. If we fix the drainage the way I've been planning, that land becomes genuinely productive. Right now, Price is leasing it because it suits his temporary needs. Long term, with proper conditioning, it should be running our own cattle. How long to fix it? 2 seasons of work. Maybe 2.5. And the bloodline. The bloodline is the most valuable thing on the property that has nothing to do with the land. If we expand the breeding program properly, with documentation and a reputation behind it, we're not selling breeding access for $40 or $50 a contract. We're looking at considerably more. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. Doyle said something interesting. He said the rail company, when they want water access rights, sometimes prefers to negotiate an ongoing arrangement rather than a purchase, like a lease of the water rights rather than a sale. That's actually better, Corinne said. A sale is one payment. A lease is income every year. That's what he said. She thought about the numbers. What a water rights lease might bring annually, combined with a mature breeding program, combined with the south section recovered and running. None of it was certain. All of it was possible. A year ago, none of it had been either. You're planning ahead, she said. You keep telling me the shape of the problem matters. I'm trying to see the shape of the solution. She looked at the road ahead. The shape of the solution is that this ranch has more assets than anyone knew, including you, and those assets are starting to become visible. The question is whether we can hold on long enough for the visibility to matter. We're still holding, he said. Yes, she said. We are. When they got back, there was a horse at the gate that neither of them recognized. A good-looking bay with a professional saddle and a brand she didn't know. They found the rider in the yard talking to Pete Calder, who had apparently arrived separately, and beside Calder was the man Corinne recognized as Fowler, the new rancher Ruth Hennessy had mentioned. I came to look at the cattle, Calder said by way of explanation. He seemed slightly embarrassed. I brought Fowler. I asked to come, Fowler said directly. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, broad-shouldered, with the look of a man who'd come to Texas with money and enough sense to know he didn't know everything. Mrs. Hennessy told me about your breeding program. I lost 61 head last winter, 61 out of 230. I'd like to understand what you're doing differently. Wesley looked at Corinne. Come see the cattle, she said. She walked Fowler and Calder through the north section for an hour, showing them the calves, explaining the bloodline, letting them examine the animals up close. Fowler was methodical about it. He asked good questions, the kind that showed he understood what he was looking at, and he made notes in a small book he kept in his breast pocket. Calder was quieter. He'd seen some of the cattle before, but not the calves, and he stood looking at one of the spring calves for a long time without saying anything. This one, he said, the coat on this one. From the primary bloodline, Corinne said. Born in a late storm in April, the temperature dropped to 14 degrees the second night of its life. Calder looked at her. It survived. Without intervention, it was on its feet the next morning. Calder was quiet for another moment. He'd lost 22 calves to that April storm. She knew that because he'd told her, with the flat effect of a man who'd stopped being surprised by loss. "What do you want for a breeding contract?" he asked. "We're not taking new contracts until fall," she said. "We want to see the full results of this season before we expand. Come back in October with your numbers and we'll talk." Fowler looked up from his notebook. "That's a longer timeline than I'd like." "It's the honest one," she said. "I'm not going to sell you a program I can't fully stand behind yet. Come in October." Fowler looked at Wesley. "Your operation," he said, with a slight inflection of a question, checking, as they all checked, who was actually in charge here. "Her program," Wesley said. "Come in October." Fowler nodded slowly. He looked at the calf once more. "All right." After they left, Wesley and Corinne stood in the north pasture in the long July evening light. The sun was going down behind them and throwing everything east in gold, and the cattle were settling into their patterns for the night. The calves were grouped near their mothers, their small, dense shapes moving slowly in the grass. "Fowler will come back in October," Wesley said. "He will. Calder will probably bring someone with him. Possibly." He was quiet for a moment. "Things are moving." "Things are moving," she agreed. "That's not the same as things being settled." "I know." He bent down and picked up a handful of the north pasture's soil, that unconscious habit she'd noticed him developing, the one that used to be hers, and crumbled it between his fingers. "The soil here is different from April," he said. "Denser, more moisture in it. The rotation's letting it recover. It'll be better still in the fall." He dropped the soil. He looked at his hand for a second, then brushed it clean on his trousers. "My father walked this pasture every evening. I remember watching him from the house when I was small. He'd walk the whole perimeter before dark, and I never knew why." "He was reading it," Corinne said. "The same way you're reading it now." Wesley looked at her. "You've been checking the pasture condition every morning since June," she said. "I've seen you. You didn't used to do that." He didn't say anything. "You're learning to see it," she said. "What took him years you're doing in months because you have somewhere to start from. His records." He was quiet for a long time. A night bird called somewhere in the eastern trees near the creek, and the cattle moved softly in the dusk. "The assessment notice from the bank," he said. "Doyle is pushing back on the timeline. But even if they extend it, they're still going to send someone. Someone is still going to come out here and put a number on this place." "Yes." "Are we ready for that?" She thought about the 22 pages, the breeding records, the rotation logs, the contracts. The calves in the north pasture, the south section recovering under Price's cattle. The creek running clean along the eastern boundary with a formal water rights claim filed in the county records. "We're as ready as we can be," she said, "which is more ready than we were 6 weeks ago, and considerably more ready than I thought we'd be when I walked through your gate in April." He looked at the calves in the gathering dark. "I'm glad you walked through," he said. He said it simply, without looking at her, the way he said the things that cost him something to say. She didn't answer right away. The night was coming down over the panhandle in that particular way it did in summer. Not all at once, but in degrees, the light pulling back slowly like a tide. "I'm glad I stayed," she said finally, which was the truest answer she had. They stood in the pasture until the last light went, and then they walked back to the house through the dark, and the cattle settled around them, and the creek moved quietly in the east, and somewhere in the county records office in Wheeler County, a document with both their names on it was sitting in a file, patient and official, waiting to be needed. The bank's assessor arrived on a Thursday morning 3 weeks later, and his name was Gerald Pratt, and he came from Wichita Falls, which was far enough from Clarendon to be genuinely outside Bent's immediate circle of influence, something Doyle had quietly ensured through a contact he hadn't explained and Corinne hadn't asked about. Pratt was a methodical, gray-haired man who carried a clipboard and asked precise questions and showed no particular reaction to anything he saw, which was either professional neutrality or genuine indifference, and she couldn't tell which. He walked the pastures with her and Wesley for 4 hours. He examined the cattle. He looked at the breeding records. He reviewed the grazing rotation logs. He said almost nothing during any of this, just made notes in a precise hand on his clipboard. At the end of the day, he sat at the kitchen table and went through his notes for a long time. "The documentation here is thorough," he said finally. "Yes," Corinne said. "The herd condition is materially better than the prior assessment indicated. We've been working on it since April. The bloodline records are—" He paused, looking at something on his clipboard. "I've not seen anything like these in a property assessment before. 15 years of breeding outcomes is unusual. The previous owner kept careful records." Pratt looked up. "The breeding contracts. Are these all executed and on file?" "Copies are here. Originals are with Doyle in Wheeler County." He made a note. He looked at his clipboard for another moment. "The water rights claim that was recently filed. I'm required to note that as a pending matter. It affects the valuation." "In which direction?" Wesley asked. Pratt looked at him steadily. "That depends on the outcome of the commissioner's vote. A pending claim with documented historical use and a formal filing is different from an undocumented claim." He paused. "Significantly different." "How significantly?" Corinne asked. Pratt set his clipboard face down on the table. It was a small gesture, but it felt deliberate, like he was speaking off the record. "The assessment I file with the bank will reflect the property's current documented condition, which is considerably improved from what the prior records show. I cannot tell you what the bank will do with that assessment. That's not my part of it." He picked his clipboard back up. "I can tell you that what I've seen today is not what I was led to expect when this assignment was given to me." Corinne looked at him carefully. "What were you led to expect?" Pratt stood and gathered his papers. "A struggling operation in material decline." He looked around the kitchen, at the neat order of it, at the stacked ledgers visible through the office door, at Lupe sleeping in the corner with the complete confidence of a dog who knew where she lived. "That is not what this is. Not—" He left at 5 o'clock and they watched his wagon go down the road to the gate, and when he was out of sight, Wesley exhaled slowly. "He's going to file an honest assessment," he said. "I think so." "What does that mean for the bank?" "It means the grounds for calling the note early become very thin. A bank that tries to force collection on an improving operation based on a prior assessment is going to have a hard time defending that decision if it ends up in front of a judge." She paused. "It means Bent has lost this particular move. He'll find another one." "Maybe, but we've bought time." She turned toward the house. "And time is what this whole thing has been about from the beginning." Wesley stood at the gate, looking at the road for another moment. "Corinne," he said. She stopped. "When this is over, when the debt is settled and the water rights are sorted and the breeding program is established." He stopped. He seemed to be choosing words with more care than usual. "I want to make this a proper arrangement, not a wage situation." She turned around and looked at him. "A partnership," he said, "legal and documented. Half the operation." He said it directly, which was the only way he said things. "You built half of what this is now, more than half." She looked at him standing there at the gate in the evening light, his hat in his hand, his face carrying everything he hadn't said over the past months. The grief for a father who'd built something without explaining it. The long wait of years of not quite failing but never quite succeeding either. And underneath all of it, something that had been slowly coming back to him since April. Something that looked, in this particular light, like the belief that things could be different. "Ask me again when the debt is settled," she said. "I don't make arrangements when things are still unsettled." "That's not a no?" "It's not a no," she agreed. She went inside. He stayed at the gate for a moment longer, and then he followed her in, and the door closed behind him, and the panhandle night came down over the ranch the way it had always come. Indifferent to human affairs, patient as geology, unimpressed by hope, and unmoved by failure. The same dark it had always been, and would always be, regardless of what the people inside the small-lit house decided to do with the time they had. Pratt's assessment reached the bank's regional board in Wichita Falls on a Friday, and Aldrich had his answer by the following Tuesday. The note would not be called early. Doyle sent word by rider, a short note in his terse handwriting. Assessment filed. Board declined early collection. Original terms stand. CD. Wesley read it at the kitchen table and set it down and didn't say anything for a moment. Corinne was standing at the stove and she heard the silence change quality, from the tense, waiting kind to something looser, and she turned around. "Original terms," she said. "Original terms," he confirmed. She turned back to the stove. Her hands were not entirely steady, which she found annoying, but there it was. 4 months of building toward this moment, and now that it was here, she didn't quite know what to do with her body. "We still need to pay the debt," she said, "by end of summer." "I know. We're not celebrating yet." "I'm not celebrating. I'm just sitting here." He looked at the note again. "Bent lost this one. He lost this move. He's still bent." "Yes." He set the note down on the table. "But he lost this one." She allowed that. It was true, and true things deserve to be acknowledged, even when they came with complications still attached. What happened next with Bent was not what either of them expected, which was perhaps the most honest thing about it. They'd been bracing for another angle, another letter, another pressure point, some new approach through a back channel they hadn't anticipated. Instead, for 2 weeks, nothing. No correspondence, no riders at the gate, no word through the county's considerable rumor network. Then Ruth Hennessy came by on a Thursday, the way she did, unannounced and direct. "Bent's in negotiation with the rail company," she said, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee. "Not about your land, about his own. Apparently they've adjusted the right-of-way survey. The new route runs 2 miles further north, through the corner of Bent's upper section, instead of along your creek boundary." Corinne put her coffee cup down carefully. "The route changed 3 weeks ago, according to what I'm hearing, before Doyle filed your water rights claim, as it happens." Ruth looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who found human behavior consistently interesting. "Which means your water rights, while real and properly filed, are not quite as dramatically valuable as you may have been led to believe." The silence in the kitchen was significant. Corinne looked at this table. She ran through it. What the route change meant for the water rights value. What it meant for the water rights claim. What it meant for everything she'd been calculating. "How much less valuable?" she asked. "Considerably," Ruth said. "Creek water for grazing purposes, not infrastructure purposes." "Which is meaningful, but it's a different number." Wesley looked at Corinne. She looked back at him. "Bent was chasing something that was already moving," Wesley said slowly. "It looks that way," Ruth said. "The survey changed before he filed his offer to you. He may not have known yet, or he may have been hoping to complete the purchase before the news traveled." She paused. "Either way, you held, and now the pressure is off." Corinne sat back in her chair. She was doing the recalculation quickly, sorting through what this changed and what it didn't. The water rights were still worth filing. Creek water rights in a dry region were not nothing, but $15,000 had just become something considerably more modest. Enough to matter, not enough to transform. "The breeding program still works," she said. It came out almost reflexively because it was the thing underneath everything else. The thing that had been real since before any of the water rights conversation had started. "Your breeding program works regardless of who builds what railroad where," Ruth said. "That was always true. It was true before you arrived. It was just sitting in ledgers nobody was reading." Wesley looked at the table. "So the ranch survives on its actual merits." "That was always the only version worth having," Corinne said. Ruth finished her coffee and stood up. "I'm bringing Fowler on Saturday. He wants to see the October calves. He's ready to discuss contracts." She looked at Corinne. "The calf I got from your program is the strongest animal I've added to my herd in 5 years. I want 2 more contracts next year, not 1. After she left, Corinne and Wesley sat at the table for a while without speaking. The morning light was doing what it did in September on the Panhandle, coming in low and amber through the east window, making the room look warmer than it was. "We built the right thing," Wesley said finally. "We built what was already there," she said. "We just didn't let it disappear." He looked at her. "You know that's not a small thing." "I know. Most things disappear because nobody does exactly that." She didn't argue with him because he was right, and she was learning, slowly, against a lifetime of habit, that when someone said a true thing to her, she didn't need to qualify it into something smaller. The fall sale came in October, and the results were what she'd projected and slightly better. The average animal was carrying 43 pounds more than the prior year's sale weight. At the prices they got, still not what the market had been in better years, but stable, the sale produced just over $1,100. Combined with the breeding contract payments that had cleared in August, the grazing lease from Price, and what remained of the breeding contracts with Fowler and 2 new ranchers Ruth had sent their way, they came to the end of summer with $1,480 in documented income against an $1,800 debt. They were still short. The gap was $320, and it sat between them and solvency like a piece of bad weather that wouldn't move. Wesley rode to Clarendon on a Wednesday in late October to talk to Aldrich. He went alone because he'd said he needed to do this part himself, which Corinne understood and respected, even though she'd spent the entire day working in the south section with a particular focused energy that was her version of not pacing. He came back late in the afternoon. She heard the horse and came out of the barn and looked at his face, which told her most of it before he spoke. "He'll take $1,400 and extend the remaining balance to spring," Wesley said, "at the original interest rate. No adjustment." Aldrich agreed to that. He did. Wesley dismounted and handed her the horse's reins without thinking about it, the way people do when they've been working alongside someone long enough that tasks distribute naturally. I think Pratt's assessment changed something, or the board's involvement changed something. Aldrich was different, less sure of himself. Bent's influence has probably diminished since the rail route changed. Probably. He untacked the horse himself, which he'd been doing more of lately. "We still owe $320 in spring. By spring, we'll have it." "You're certain?" She thought about Fowler's contracts, about the 2 new ranchers, about the south section which Price had already asked about leasing again, about the calves in the north pasture who were going to be market-ready by April. "I'm not certain of anything," she said, "but the shape of this problem is very small now. $320 in 6 months with the operation running the way it's running. That's not the problem we had in April." He looked at her. "It's a Tuesday problem," she said, "not a catastrophe." He laughed at that. A real one, the kind she'd come to recognize as genuine because it always seemed to surprise him slightly. "A Tuesday problem," he repeated. "Manageable, annoying, not fatal." He shook his head, but he was still almost smiling. "All right, a Tuesday problem." The partnership agreement was signed in November in Doyle's office in Wheeler County, with Ruth Hennessy as witness because she'd volunteered and because she had the particular quality of making official things feel properly witnessed. The document gave Corinne 40% of the operation. She'd pushed back on the 50% he'd originally offered because 40 felt more accurate to what she'd actually built versus what he'd held together through the years before she arrived, and she didn't like arrangements that felt inflated. Wesley had argued with her about that for 2 evenings. 50%, he'd said. That's what it should be. 40 is what I want. You saved this ranch. You didn't lose it, she said. Those are different things, and they both count. He'd looked at her with the particular expression he got when he knew he wasn't going to win an argument, but hadn't fully accepted it yet. 40% with the right to renegotiate in 3 years, she'd said, after we see where the breeding program goes. He'd accepted that. Not gracefully, but genuinely. In Doyle's office, signing the agreement, Ruth had looked at the document and said, "Your father would have found this arrangement strange, Wesley. A woman on the deed." "Yes," Wesley said. "He would have come around to it," Ruth said. "He came around to most things eventually. He just needed time." Corinne signed her name on the line below Wesley's, and the ink dried, and that was that. What came after was not a sudden transformation. That was the thing nobody told you about recovery. It didn't arrive all at once, and it didn't feel like a conclusion. It felt like Tuesday after Tuesday after Tuesday, each one a little different from the last. The changes accumulating the way soil builds, slowly, invisibly, until one day you dig down and find something solid where there used to be nothing. The spring brought what she'd predicted. Fowler's contracts cleared. 2 more ranchers, one from the next county, one who'd heard about the bloodline through a cattle auction conversation, came to them in February with serious inquiries. The south section yielded its first genuine Crow Ranch calves in May, the drainage having been addressed over the winter with a drainage project that took 3 weeks and the labor of 4 hired men and was filthy, exhausting work that Corinne supervised and occasionally joined because she didn't believe in telling people to do things she wouldn't do herself. The $320 was paid to Aldrich in March, in cash, 2 months early. Wesley had put the bills on the banker's desk, and Aldrich had counted them with the expression of a man who'd expected a different outcome and was professionally concealing his feelings about it. "Loan satisfied," Aldrich said. "Yes," Wesley said. That was the entirety of the conversation. The breeding program became something neither of them had quite predicted in terms of scale. It grew not through advertising or promotion. They did none of that, but through the oldest mechanism available, which was results. Ranchers who bred their cattle through the Crow program lost fewer animals. The calves were smaller at birth than fashionable breeding produced, which continued to put off a certain kind of buyer who measured value in immediate size. But the animals that lived through their first winter and their second and their third became something the region hadn't quite seen before. Cattle that the Panhandle's hardest seasons couldn't break. Word moved the way word moves in isolated country. Slowly, sideways, through channels that had nothing to do with intention. A rancher in Wheeler County mentioned it to a man he met at a land auction. That man mentioned it to his brother-in-law. The brother-in-law came to look and signed a contract and mentioned it to someone else. By the fourth year, they had a waiting list. Corinne had not expected a waiting list. She'd expected success. She'd been fairly confident of the direction from early on, whatever she'd said out loud about uncertainty. But success and a waiting list were different things. A waiting list meant decisions about how large to grow and how fast, and those decisions required thinking she hadn't done yet. She and Wesley had that argument over several evenings in the fall of the fourth year, in the office that had once been his father's, surrounded by ledgers that now included 4 years of her own records, layered on top of the 15 years of the original. "We expand the program," Wesley said. "We have the bloodline, we have the documentation, we have the reputation. The limit right now is the number of animals we can run. Expanding too fast breaks things," she said. "We lose control of the documentation quality. We start producing animals we can't fully stand behind. We hire someone to help with records." "Who? Someone who knows cattle breeding records specifically?" She looked at him. "That's not a common skill." "You weren't common when you walked through my gate." She looked at him steadily. That was objectively a better argument than she wanted to give him credit for. "Carefully," she said. "We expand carefully. One additional hired hand who I train myself. Documented process for everything. If the quality slips for any reason, we pull back." "Agreed." "I mean it, Wesley. If we chase the waiting list too hard, we become something we're not." "I understand that." He leaned back in the chair, the same chair his father had sat in, the one that had a particular creak on the right rear leg. "My father built this bloodline slowly on purpose. He could have tried to scale it earlier and he didn't. I'm not going to undo that." She looked at him. "When did you start thinking about it that way? What your father did deliberately versus what he just did?" He thought about it. "Gradually. The more I understood the records, the more I understood there were choices in them, things he could have done differently and didn't. After a while, I stopped thinking he was just being stubborn and started thinking he was being careful." He paused. "It changes how I think about him." "Better or worse?" "Both, honestly. Better because he was smarter than I gave him credit for. Worse because—" He stopped. "Because I wish he'd explained it. Because I spent years watching a man work without knowing what I was watching." She was quiet for a moment. "He might not have known how to explain it. Some people build things they can't find words for." "I know." He said it simply. "I've made my peace with it." She believed him, mostly. People made peace with things in layers, and the layers didn't all settle at once, but the top layers could be genuine even when deeper ones were still unsettled. She'd made her own peace with enough things to know how that worked. Lupe died in the 5th year, which was not unexpected. She'd been a grown dog when Corinne arrived, and her muzzle had gone gray and her step had slowed through that last winter. But it landed harder than either of them would have predicted, the way the loss of an animal does when it's been the quiet constant of daily life for long enough. They buried her at the edge of the north pasture, where she'd spent more of her working life than anywhere else, and Wesley dug the grave himself and didn't say anything while he was doing it. And Corinne stood nearby and didn't say anything either, because some things don't need commentary. After, walking back to the house, Wesley said, "She never barked at you from the first day." "I noticed. She barked at everyone for at least a week, sometimes longer." He looked at the pasture. "I decided then that you were probably going to work out." Corinne looked at him sideways. "You decided based on the dog." "The dog had good judgment." She thought about saying something to that, and then didn't, and they walked back to the house in the late afternoon, and she thought about a gray cattle dog sitting down next to her left boot on the first day, and how much had turned on that small vote of confidence from an animal who didn't speak and didn't explain herself, and just knew what she knew. The 6th year brought drought, which was not unusual on the Panhandle, but was severe enough that two of the operations they'd built relationships with took serious losses. The Crow Ranch took losses too. This was not a story where the right preparation made you immune to the land's indifference. They lost 9 head through the summer, more than any year since Corinne had arrived, and the pasture recovery they'd built was strained in a way that worried her. But the bloodline animals, the core herd, the descendants of the original 11, came through in a way that was documented and measurable, and to anyone who'd been watching long enough, not surprising. The survival differential between the bloodline animals and the general herd was wider in drought conditions than it had been in cold conditions. The compact frame required less water. The foraging instinct was stronger. The animals found feed in places where other cattle stood and waited. Fowler rode over in October of that drought year, unsolicited, and stood in the north pasture and looked at the herd for a long time. "I lost 43 head this summer," he said. "I'm sorry," Wesley said. 16 of them were from your breeding program. The other 27 were from my original stock." He paused. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Your original animals died at a higher rate," Corinne said. "Nearly twice the rate." He looked at her. "I had people telling me for years that smaller-framed cattle were inferior, uneconomical. I believed them for a long time." He looked back at the herd. "I don't anymore." He expanded his contract to the largest they had with any single rancher, and he told the 2 men he knew best in the region, and both of them came to see the ranch before the year was out. The waiting list got longer. Clifford Bent died in the 7th year. Not dramatically, not as a consequence of anything he'd done or failed to do in regard to the Crow Ranch, but simply of the ordinary failures of a body that had been 60-something years old. He died in his house on his large property with his matched horses in his barn, a wealthy man whose particular ambitions had mostly been achieved in other directions, and whose attempt to absorb the Crow Ranch's water rights had turned out to be one of his rare miscalculations. Corinne heard about it in town and came home and told Wesley, and he was quiet for a moment. "I don't feel the way I expected to feel," he said. "How did you expect to feel?" "I don't know, something stronger." He thought about it. "He was trying to do to me what probably happened to my father in that land dispute years ago. Take advantage of someone in a weak moment." He paused. "But I was in a weak moment, and it didn't work, and now he's gone, and I'm still here. That feels like enough." Corinne thought about that for a while after, about what it meant to be still there. She'd spent a long time in her life before the Crow Ranch being technically still there, surviving, moving, finding the next position before the current one became untenable. Survival as a practice, as a full-time occupation. She hadn't fully understood until she'd been at this ranch for a few years that there was a significant difference between being still there and actually being somewhere, between not losing and genuinely having. She understood it now. She'd needed to stay in one place long enough to feel the difference, and she'd resisted staying in one place for most of her adult life because staying required a kind of trust she'd had no particular reason to develop. Wesley had given her a reason, without meaning to, simply by being exactly what she'd assessed him to be in the first hour, a man who was in trouble and was telling the truth about it, and who had the decency to accept help when it arrived, and who never once tried to take credit for things she'd built. Those were not romantic qualities, she'd have told you. They were practical ones. But she'd lived long enough to know that practical qualities, sustained over years, amounted to something romance usually didn't. In the 10th year of their partnership, a writer for a regional agricultural journal came to the ranch to document the breeding program for a publication that went to ranchers across 4 states. He was a young man with a notebook and more enthusiasm than experience, and he spent 2 days asking questions and looking at everything, and he told them the article would likely be read by several thousand people. Wesley thought this was fine. Corinne had mixed feelings about it, which she kept mostly to herself. The young man's last question on the afternoon of his second day was directed at Corinne. They were standing in the north pasture, the same pasture where she'd walked fence line on her first day, now considerably healthier than it had been, with cattle moving in the patterns she'd spent years establishing. "When you arrived here," the young man said with the earnestness of someone who believed in clean origin stories, "did you know this is what it would become?" She looked at the cattle. She thought about the honest answer, which was not the satisfying one. "No," she said. "I knew there was something worth finding. I didn't know if we'd find it in time or if finding it would be enough. Those were different questions. What made you stay? She was quiet for a moment. I don't make decisions to stay. I make decisions to keep working on the problem in front of me. Staying is just what happens when the problem turns out to be worth it. The young man wrote that down, and she didn't think anything of it, and it appeared in the article almost verbatim, and several people over the years quoted it back to her in contexts she hadn't anticipated. She never knew quite what to make of that. Wesley read the article when it came out and set it on the kitchen table. "You said something good," he told her. "I said something accurate. Those aren't always the same thing. When they are, it's worth noting." She looked at the article. Her name was in it, and his name was in it, and his father's name was in it. Howard Crow, the man who kept records and left eggs on a neighbor's porch, and spent 12 years building something he couldn't find words for. She'd thought about him more times than she'd expected to over the years, this man she'd never met, whose handwriting she knew better than most people's faces. He'd built something and almost lost it, not through failure, but through the ordinary human difficulty of passing things on. The knowledge in his head and the knowledge in his ledgers had not quite connected to the person who needed them most, and the gap between those two things had nearly been the end of everything. She thought about all the things that got lost that way, all the careful work that never made it across the space between one person and the next. The knowledge that lived and died in a single generation because nobody found the right words or the right moment or the right person standing at the gate at the right time. That was the thing she'd come to believe. In the 10 years since she'd walked through that iron gate with a rifle and a canvas sack and $4.60. Not that things worked out, not that the right person always showed up, but that the gap between what got built and what got kept was not inevitable. It was a problem, like any other problem. And problems had people-shaped answers if enough people were paying attention. Howard Crow had paid attention for 12 years with no guarantee anyone would ever understand what he was doing. He'd kept the records anyway. She'd paid attention to the records. Wesley had paid attention to her. And what had come from that chain of attention, unremarkable link by unremarkable link, was a ranch that stood on solid ground and a breeding program that would outlast all of them, and a life that felt, most mornings, like the right one. Not a perfect one. Not a smooth or easy or predictable one. Just the right one. 30 years after Corin Ashford first walked through the gate of the Crow Ranch, travelers crossing the Texas Panhandle would sometimes pass a place where the grass was unusually good, and the cattle were compact and dense-coated even in summer, and the land had a settled, worked quality that you could feel without quite being able to name. Old-timers in the nearest towns, when asked about it, told the story the same way every time. Not with drama, but with the quiet satisfaction of people who'd watched something improbable succeed. They'd say, the ranch was near gone when a woman arrived with a rifle and a canvas sack and started reading the old records. They'd say she found what the father had built, and she and the son put it together, and it held. They'd say it held through drought and debt and a powerful man trying to take it, and it came out the other side still standing. And when people asked who deserved the credit, the rancher who held on, or the woman who saw what others missed, the old-timers would usually pause, because it was the kind of question that resisted the clean answer people were always hoping for. Then one of them would say, the way one of them always eventually did, it wasn't about credit. It was about paying attention to what was already there and not letting it disappear. That's all it ever was. And more often than not, that turned out to be enough.